Hi, I'm Savannah. I'm a communications major, and I'm going to be covering the uses of social judgment theory, and I'm going to cover the pros and cons.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I'm a digital communications major, and I will be covering the real-life scenarios of social judgment theory.
Hi, I'm Pierce. I'm a communications major, and I'll be covering a brief overview and practical application of social judgment theory, as well as activity one.
Hi, my name is Cole Mackay, and I'll be covering the theorists on social judgment theory as well as an activity, and I'm a senior here at UTSA.
Hello, my name is Amani Larry. I'm a junior communications major, and I will be covering the key concepts of the social judgment theory.
So, a brief overview of social judgment theory. As stated here, social judgment theory is the perception and evaluation of every new idea and comparing it with present thoughts. According to Muzassar Sharif, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, he was a social psychologist at the University of Oklahoma, and he explained this idea of how whenever we're introduced to new information, we tend to weigh it using our own personal biases and previous information that we already have. Next slide, please. So here's a short clip from the cartoon Animaniacs. Go ahead and roll the cartoon.
Yako, it's time to take the ink blot test. Now, tell me, what does this remind you of?
Girls.
What does this remind you of?
Girls.
What does this remind you of?
Girls.
You are obsessed with girls!
Hey, you're the one showing me all the sexy pictures.
Oh.
So as sort of humorously displayed here, a Rorschach test is a test in which we are presented with different, mostly nonsensical images, and we are told to display what we personally think. And in many ways, social judgment theory acts as that sort of Rorschach test, in which we, whenever we are given new information, once again, we apply it to our own personal biases. We may jump to our own conclusions based on some sort of possibly even menial type of statement that may or may not line up with our own personal biases and beliefs. And again, in that way, social judgment theory acts as a kind of Rorschach test. All right, next slide, please.
Yako, it's time.
So social judgment theory in the real world. There are definitely many practical applications of social judgment theory, many of which happen in a casual or workplace setting that we might not even be aware of. For example, even in the situation of maybe talking with a coworker, they may tell you some news about some issue that's already been happening, and before you've even been given the context or the background about what's going on about it, you may have already been kind of coming up with your own personal conclusions or your own personal beliefs without even having much of the information. And a lot of it can actually also be applied to the ways in which we word our own statements to others. For example, in a concept that will be touched on later in this presentation, there is something called the latitude of acceptance, in which we are more inclined to take in certain messages that may even possibly be from a source that we disagree with, but if they're worded in a way that falls within our latitude of acceptance, we are more likely to accept this statement. And so that's just one example of social judgment theory in a practical sense, and shows just why wording matters in statements. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the theorists behind this theory. So the main person who basically came up with the theory was Muzaffar Sharif, or Sheriff. I'm not completely sure how to pronounce his name. but he was a psychologist at the University of Oklahoma, and he analyzed that we hear a message basically, and we immediately judged where it should be placed on our attitude scale. And he realized that this kind of sorting of ideas was subconscious, and it occurs instantaneously upon our perception of a message. He ultimately called this the social judgment involvement approach, but most scholars today just refer to it as the social judgment theory. He's also responsible for coming up with the 3 zones of latitudes, and which were originally called attitudes, but they were later changed to latitudes. And he was also aided by his wife, Carolyn Sharif. The second theorist is Carl Ivar Hovland, and he was a psychologist at Yale University, and he kind of aided Sharif in his findings of the social judgment theory. He primarily studied the attitude and persuasion aspect of it, which ultimately led to the differing width in latitudes, which we'll cover later on. And he also thought of the idea that if people are part of certain groups, the ability to resist the persuasion is dependent on the degree of belonging in that group. So if you had a closer group of friends, basically, that you could be ultimately persuaded a little more. A couple of psychologists that I also wanted to note that I found their information very useful in the advancement of understanding of the overall understanding of this theory is Irvin Janis and Leon Mann, who they were psychologists at Yale University, and they basically surveyed a group of women at a college to find out their attitudes towards smoking and their behaviors towards it. And ultimately, they judged each individual's perception and attempted to change it through a series of scenarios that they presented to them.
Okay, so now I'm going to touch on some key concepts of the social judgment theory. It was briefly talked about before. Muzar Sharif, he had these 3 zones of attitudes, and the zones were the latitude of acceptance, the latitude of rejection, and the latitude of non-commitment. The latitude of acceptance is basically the range of ideas that a person sees as reasonable or worthy of consideration. The example I'm going to use would be if on a scale of far right conservatives and far left liberals, if that was the scale, then you have your people all the way on the right, and the conservatives they have their own latitude of acceptance of their conservative values, as well as their latitude of rejection, which in some sense will be more closer to the left side of the liberals' values, and vice versa. So the latitude of rejection is the range of opinions that someone finds objectionable. So again, looking at conservatives and liberals, they both have their differing views that on the opposite ends, they do not agree with. And the latitude of non-commitment, it is simply the range of ideas a person finds neither acceptable or objectionable. So then you have those people that are kind of in the middle. They can lean either on the right side of conservative or the left side, just depending on the topic at hand. The example they used in the book was based off of gun control, where we did a little survey and we circled the statements that we agreed with, crossed out the statements we disagreed with, and all those just symboled our latitude of acceptances and rejection, as well as our non-commitment. And moving on to the ego involvement. Ego involvement is basically the importance of centrality in a person's life. The symbol that they used in the book, they were talking about Ryan and David, who were the characters of the antidote, being in their opinions on gun control. So if you have a extreme opinion about a certain topic and your passion runs deep, you have a bigger anchor. That was the symbol that they used to say that your views or your anchor. So if a person was a far left liberal, and they were all on the left side of the political spectrum, their anchor will be a lot bigger than a person who was more in the middle. So with that being said, large attitude anchors, they're generally found, like I said, towards the end of the scales. And we're gonna go more into figuring out your anchors in the third activity. Now moving on to the boomerang effect. The attitude change, which is the boomerang effect, is the attitude change in the opposite direction of what the message advocates. So it's basically saying if you want to persuade somebody, if a conservative tries to persuade a liberal to be on their side, it might have an effect where instead of bringing them over, it drives them further away because of the fact that their latitude of acceptance is so big towards liberalism. That conservative value that they just heard pushes them even further away from ever going over there. Next slide, please. These are some other topics that I just want to quickly touch on. Contrast is the perceptual distortion that leads to the polarization of ideas, which is basically, in a sense, the social judgment label captures the idea of a link between ego involvement and perception. So if you are a highly committed person, if your anchor is very big, or if you're on either side of those scales, then you have a larger than normal latitude of rejection. This means that any message that might fall in that range will be perceived further away from your anchor than it really is. So now let's look at the conservative side. If you're all the way on the right of the conservatism, but you hear a kind of is in reality is in the middle of the political spectrum, but your latitude of rejection is so far big because your anchor is larger than normal, you're gonna perceive it as left. According to Sheriff, this only happens if the message happens to fall within that latitude of rejection. Next, we have assimilation, which is a perceptual distortion where people judge messages that fall within their latitude of acceptance as less discrepant from their anchor than they really are. So it's kind of, in a sense, the opposite of contrast. This only happens if the message falls into your latitude of acceptance. So it's like a rubber band effect, and it draws that idea even closer to what it really is. And they're still kind of unsure how this affects the latitude of non-commitment, mainly because those are the bipartial parties. They're just in the middle. They can go either way. And reference groups, really quickly, they're just the group that members use to identify their identity. So just whatever social group you kind of belong to or you self-identify as. And pluralistic ignorance is the mistaken idea that everyone is doing or thinking something that they aren't.
So I'm going to go over some of the uses of social judgment theory. Going off the kind of like the example in our book, setting arguments for public policies, looking at what it talked about in our book, like the gun control, that discussion that the two guys had, I don't remember their names, just taking this theory into thought when you're thinking about how you're going to present some type of policy or some type of law you want to propose. It changes the way that you're going to word it, the way you're going to present it, because you're taking into consideration people's latitude of acceptance, their rejection, everything like that. Talking about like convincing a friend to go on a night they don't want to. You know your friends better than anyone, so you're going to know whether or not they're the type that's going to be impulsive and is ready to go out whenever, or they're the type they're a homebody and they're not going to want to go out. So you already know their latitudes of acceptance and rejection. So you can set up that argument of being like, oh, you're gonna feel FOMO, like you're gonna miss out, you're gonna hate it, and then you convince them to go out. Or you know your friend that's a homebody, you can't really convince them. You know they're gonna want to stay home and be in their bed all night. I wanted to talk about like deciding on a college or a university to attend. Thinking about it, if your parents want you to go to like Harvard, and so you go to visit the school just to please your parents, you know, just to like make them happy, make them think, oh, like I'm actually taking this into consideration. That school, whatever they present to you is already falling onto your latitude of rejection because it's not something you're interested in. Their argument's going to go in when you're out the other. Whereas if you wanted to go like UTSA, whenever you go to visit their campus, whatever they give it to you, whatever they can offer you, it's going to fall into your latitude of acceptance. So it's going to be something you're more willing to perceive, you're more willing to take into consideration, even if it's like not what your parents want, it's what you want. That argument falls under that. Okay. So hitting some of the pros and cons, I wanted to hit on the cons first of social judgment theory. There are some like ethical concerns behind it. Um, it's pretty difficult to measure exactly how it's working because people will say one thing falls into this category of their lives, and when they really think about it, really analyze where it is, it's not where they think it is. So you're getting initial answers that aren't backed up by what they show. And there's little to no evidence for the boomerang effect exactly. Obviously, there are going to be some arguments that they're going to have the opposite effect of what the person arguing for wants, but there's no real way to kind of prove that that's something that's going to happen consistently or with the specific arguments. Some of the pros of social justice theory are that like it itself is a testable theory. It can be proven over and over again. It's predictable. Like I said, like most people have a thought of what falls within their latitude of acceptance and rejection, and it's a practical theory. It works.
So I will be covering activity one. Activity one covers the latitude of acceptance. So the way activity one works out is there will be two statements listed out on here: is statement A and statement B. And a student or any number of students will have to see who the receiver of the statements is and determine which one is more likely to fall in their latitude of acceptance, which statement is most likely to be accepted. So for the example activity we have right here, the receiver would be a member of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And we have two statements, both coming from pretty much the same standpoint. One that is generally advocating for gun control, and one that would typically fall within the latitude of rejection for someone who would be a member of the NRA. But these are worded somewhat differently. So, for example, statement A is no one needs to own a gun anyway, which is just an example of a statement that someone may say in argument to someone who is pro Second Amendment and pro having their weapons. And then statement B does a similar sort of thing where it's still advocating for gun control, or at least gun safety. But the statement, well, if in the hands of someone malicious or inexperienced, guns can be extremely dangerous. And so it's worded in a more soft way. It's one that maybe gives a bit more explanation for their point of view, one that maybe sort of appeals to the sympathy if they want to try to get that. And so it's a little less blunt, and it may be a little easier to consume. And so based on these two, the student would have to determine which one is more likely to fall within the latitude of acceptance. So, fulfilling the activity here, it's reasonable to assume that statement B would be more likely to fit within the latitude of acceptance, since it's a bit less blunt. It probably explains their standpoint a little bit more instead of just stating no one needs to own a gun anyway. This one maybe explains their standpoint a little bit more, and maybe more likely to be accepted from someone who, again, as a member of the NRA, would very likely be less inclined to advocate for a gun control or gun safety measure. And so that is activity one. Next slide, please.
So for this one, I chose a clip that kind of gives, to me, an example of all three, like latitude of acceptance, rejection, and a possibility of a boomerang effect. So it's just a PSA from The Truth. it's kind of like it is an anti-vaping thing, and they frame it in this way that's just, it looks ridiculous, and that's their whole point, that vaping itself looks ridiculous. So if we were able to present this in person and in class, the first thing I would do is ask the audience before playing the clip, like what they felt there, what they feel like vaping, if they're for it, against it, or they don't care, where they feel like this clip would fall, if it'd fall under their latitude rejection, acceptance, or just the middle. We can go ahead and play it.
Check this out right here, man. You want to know how to light this? Push that right there, hold that. You know what I'm saying? Once this shit hit your asshole, you'll never go back, son. Every day about 20 times just so I stick this blowtorch thing on my ass.
Tell us exactly what a day of torching entails.
Oh, yeah. I torch in the morning after breakfast. Commute. Pretty much anytime I need to relax a little bit.
It seems relaxing.
Yeah, oh, it is. It's new, it's rechargeable. It's not like it smells or anything, except creme or mint or whatever flavor you want it to be. It's kind of like this torch scene is turning into a lifestyle thing, you know?
So do you share the torch, or do you change the nozzles when you go back and forth? How does that
Depends, you know, you share sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a very healthy, committed relationship, so.
Torching, it just brings everybody together and just having a great time, just vibing.
all the supposed benefits and avid fans of torching out there, it's no surprise that it's not a cheap hobby.
Oh yeah, he spends all his money on it.
The insertable suppository tops, or nozzles, particularly stylized ones like Gary's here, aren't cheap.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Everyone does it. You know, I go through a cartridge every couple of days. It's like 10, 20 bucks. So.
I mean, it's not bad. But it's worth it. It's like being in the future or something, you know? Unwinding with a high-tech tricked-out device like this, you know?
Gary and the other torturers blaze up pretty much wherever they feel like.
Blowing smoke out of the roof. All of my homies gon' get it. All of my homies gon' get it. All of my homies gon' get it. Running it, tripping, we did it.
Torching. Harmless habit or extremely stupid, asshole-destroying addiction?
All of my homies gon' get it. All of my homies gon' get it. All of my homies gon' get it. Running it, tripping.
No, this is fucking dumb. I didn't go to journalism school for this.
Just because it's not a cigarette does not make it safe. You might as well stick that blowtorch thing up your ass. Truth.
So obviously it frames vaping in such a ridiculous way that's the whole point. The argument is vaping is ridiculous, it looks dumb. So after playing the clip, I would just ask the audience if they still feel the same way they felt before, or if after watching this, they were like, they think, oh, that's ridiculous. Like, obviously this isn't something that would work for me. I would, if they didn't have any viewpoints on it, if they stayed not having any viewpoints on it, or if it fell into like, this is something that they would continue to advocate for, if this video purely was shown to them to be an anti-vaping ad PSA, if they would be like, oh, this would work. I just think it's a more real life kind of example.
Check this out, right?
Okay, so activity 3 is all about identifying anchors, and I chose to base this kind of in a more of a classroom setting, and took a more educational standpoint. And so in a classroom, you would basically get a group of 3 to 5 students together and present a controversial issue to them and lay out 3 different viewpoints on such issue. So the issue that I chose was pro-life or pro-choice. obviously talking about abortion, and I would lay out the three different anchors of acceptance. So we have acceptance, rejection, and non-commitment. And each of these characters that you give the group takes different sides. And then I would have each of the students create rebuttals to every side that's being taken. And I just think that this is a good way to create a healthy dialogue between students, and really while educating them and learning ways to properly persuade people and ways that might not be the best route to take.
I'm going to be talking about activity 4, and I really wanted to create just a real life simulation kind of activity, but more gearing towards child development, because I think something that's really interesting about the social judgment theory is that it applies to our everyday lives in ways we don't even understand. Like, before I read this chapter and started doing research on this, I had no idea what it was, but it was something that I've been applying to my life, as I feel like everybody does, and they just don't understand that there's somebody who actually studied this and like put a theory to it. And so a way that I really wanted to take this was with younger kids who are in elementary school, who are just starting to get to the point where they're starting to develop their own opinions and viewpoints instead of taking it from their parents or what their parents say. And so a way that this could easily be done by starting to teach kids at a young age to have those conversations and knowing where they stand and where other people stand, and kind of where like their latitude of acceptance is. And a game that like so many people play at school right now is like Four Corners, and you have the teacher say a very simple topic for kids to have, but they can still have their separate standpoints on it, whether if it's what's your favorite ice cream, and then each corner has a different ice cream, and then you kind of look around and you're like, oh, like my best friend doesn't like the same ice cream as me, like that's weird. And then you kind of just like talk about it a little bit, and whether the teacher's like wanting different people to say different things, or if you have a separate conversations about it, it just sets up for kids to start learning at a very young age of that there's different people with different views. And the older you get, the more you realize that you have kind of where you stand, and it depends on the way you're raised and the environment you grow up in of how lenient you're going to be with hearing other people out and growing up. And so just with the simulation, I think it'd be really interesting to have a younger demographic do this with very simple concepts, and then do different ages of the same concept. Even if they're for a more younger audience, you can still see the difference of their age and how they take this concept and what they do with it, and the discussions that they have.
And that sums up our presentation. That was all of our activities. Social judgment theory is something we use every day, whether we realize it or not. It applies to everything we do, every decision we make, and it's something we would have never realized. I would have never realized this was something I do if I hadn't read about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.